The billionaire's voice echoed through the glass atrium as he skipped over one name. Xavier Miles gets nothing. He's not one of us. 200 white employees clapped, some awkward, some smug. The only black intern stood frozen, humiliated, while the holiday lights above him flickered like a lie. But that night, a hidden file lands in his inbox, and what he finds could bring the entire company crashing down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The grand atrium of Hargrove Industries looked like a cathedral to capitalism that morning. Towering glass panels bathed the room in winter light. Holiday wreaths hung from brushed steel beams, and a live jazz quartet played soft renditions of classic carols as uniformed waiters floated around with champagne flutes. The annual Christmas bonus ceremony was one of the most anticipated events in the company calendar, and this year it was particularly grand. After a record-breaking quarter, rumors swirled that bonuses would be life-changing. People had shown up in their finest suits and dresses, laughter bubbling over as they posed for selfies beneath the golden company crest. Xavier Miles stood quietly near the back, his posture straight, expression composed, hands folded in front of him. At 23, he was the youngest intern to ever receive a direct invitation to the ceremony. His work in the company's data science division had been revolutionary. He'd optimized a legacy logistics algorithm, reducing costs by 8% in less than 3 months. Word had spread fast. Managers had taken notice. Whispers among his peers predicted he might even be given a surprise permanent offer. He didn't come from a pedigree school or a well-connected family. He came from Syracuse, grew up bouncing between foster homes, fought for every inch of opportunity. But none of that was visible today. In his tailored charcoal blazer and navy tie, he looked like every other overachieving finance prodigy in the room. Until CEO Douglas Hargrove took the stage. The music dimmed. A hush fell. A spotlight hit the small platform at the front of the atrium, where Douglas, clad in a rich black velvet suit and an expensive smirk, stood holding a wireless mic. Cameras clicked. Applause thundered. Douglas raised a hand, smiling like a monarch. "This year has been exceptional," he began, pacing slowly, "and exceptional effort deserves exceptional rewards." He began reading names. Applause erupted with each announcement. Gift envelopes were handed out with engraved names in gold ink. People cheered as they opened them, and gasped at the figures inside. $40,000, some even more. Xavier's heart thudded as the list thinned. "And finally," Douglas said, squinting at his assistant, "we arrive at the end of our bonus list. Every name on here has upheld the legacy of Hargrove Industries. Every one of them embodies our culture, resilience, excellence, and above all fit." He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then he smiled. "Not everyone makes the cut. Excellence isn't just about numbers. It's about tradition. It's about who we are. And sometimes it's about knowing who isn't one of us." There was a pause, that awkward, brittle kind of silence that comes just before something shatters. Xavier froze. He hadn't been called. A few heads turned. Some coworkers looked away, pretending not to notice. A manager near him gave a weak shrug, mouthing something like, "Maybe next year." The applause started again, tentative at first, then louder, trying to steamroll over the discomfort. Cameras pivoted away. Douglas beamed, holding up a glass. "Happy holidays to our Hargrove family." Xavier remained still, the heat rising behind his ears. It wasn't just about the money. It was the message, the omission, the deliberate humiliation, buried in polished words. He replayed Douglas's line, "Knowing who isn't one of us." The statement didn't just sting, it echoed. Rejected, dismissed, not for lack of talent, but because the culture, unspoken, inherited white, could not see him as part of it. The celebration carried on like nothing happened. People returned to mingling, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a public exclusion. But Xavier saw the glances, heard the murmurs, felt the insulation closing in around him, like glass wall. He stepped outside for air, snowflakes dotting his blazer as he stood on the marble steps of the building. The city hummed around him, indifferent. He didn't leave. He went back to his desk. The intern floor was mostly empty. Lights dimmed for the holiday. He slid into his chair, powered on his monitor, and pulled up his personal notes. He wasn't angry. Not outwardly, not yet. What he felt was sharper than anger. It was clarity and hunger. He reviewed the project he'd been quietly working on in the background, a side audit of the company's internal promotion algorithm. It wasn't officially assigned to him, But curiosity had driven him to run diagnostics. The results had confused him at first. Weighted parameters that deprioritize state schools, zip code origins, and undefined leadership traits that aligned heavily with certain racial demographics. He hadn't thought much of it. Until now. He didn't sleep that night. He read code, followed paths, mapped out who got promoted, who didn't, who received bonuses, who was excluded. The patterns weren't random. They were systemic, automated. Sometime after midnight, his inbox pinged. A new message. Subject: internal crisis. Urgent. From IT compliance. Untraceable. At Hargrove. Message: you don't know what you've touched. But if you want to help, check backup server 42. Credentials below. Download immediately. Do not reply. He stared at the screen. No signature. No traceable IP. But the credentials worked. And inside the backup server were logs. Old ones. Email archives. Code repositories. A different version of the algorithm he'd been studying. A version tagged with the word legacy mode. Xavier receives a cryptic email from the IT department that night, labeled internal crisis. Urgent. Xavier did not move from his chair for a long time after opening the backup server. The glow of the monitor was the only light in the otherwise dark intern floor, casting sharp shadows across his face. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan slept under a thin layer of snow, but inside his chest, something restless had begun to stir. The email had not felt like help. It felt like a warning disguised as an invitation, as if someone inside the company had decided that the truth was too heavy to carry alone. He started with the server logs attached to the folder labeled Legacy Mode. At first glance they looked harmless. System errors, performance reports, automated decisions stamped with dates going back nearly 20 years. But the deeper he scrolled, the more unsettling the patterns became. This was not just outdated code. This was a system still actively running, quietly steering decisions at the highest level of the company. Xavier cross-referenced the logs with employee records he had access to from his internship role. Promotions, bonuses, performance reviews. Each dataset alone looked clean, professionally structured, almost elegant. Together they told a different story. The algorithm assigned a numerical leadership alignment score to every employee, a hidden metric never disclosed to staff. The score weighed variables that were never explained in policy manuals. Geographic upbringing, university background, linguistic tone in internal emails, even participation in informal executive events. The more he analyzed it, the clearer it became that the score was not neutral. Zip codes associated with predominantly black neighborhoods triggered lower baseline values. State universities were weighted beneath private institutions, with long-standing donor ties to the company. Words commonly used in black professional speech patterns were flagged as low assertiveness or cultural misalignment. The system did not say race, but it did not have to. Race was embedded in everything it measured. Xavier leaned back, pressing his fingers to his temples. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't incompetence. This was architecture. He pulled records of employees he knew personally, people who had mentored him quietly, people who had disappeared from the office without explanation. One name after another surfaced, all marked with high productivity scores, but mysteriously low leadership alignment. Many of them were black, Latino, immigrants, people who had delivered results but never quite fit. Then he searched his own profile. His technical performance scores were exceptional, among the top 5% company-wide. But his leadership alignment score had been manually overridden 2 weeks earlier. A note was attached, written in neutral corporate language, that barely concealed its intent. Recommendation: limit upward exposure. Candidate demonstrates capability but lacks cultural continuity. Xavier felt something cold slide through his chest. The bonus ceremony wasn't a snap decision. It wasn't personal whim. It was policy, filtered through code, approved years ago, and protected by silence. He followed the timestamps back to the origin of the system. The earliest commit dated to the late 1990s, authored by a consulting firm, no longer in business. The comments inside the code were crude by modern standards, written in blunt language that had never been cleaned up. Phrases like risk of cultural dilution and optimize for executive homogeneity sat buried in lines no one had touched in decades. This was the legacy Douglas Hargrove had spoken about on stage. Xavier felt his jaw tighten as memory reframed itself. The CEO's smile, the applause, the word fit hanging in the air like a verdict. It wasn't just one man's prejudice. It was a machine that had learned how to exclude quietly, efficiently, and legally. A message notification popped up on his screen. Internal chat. An unfamiliar name from IT compliance appeared. The same department that had sent the email. The message was brief and carefully worded, as if every syllable had been weighed for risk. The sender did not accuse or confess, only asked if Xavier had accessed the server successfully, and warned him not to save anything locally. There was urgency in the restraint, fear in the professionalism. Xavier responded cautiously, confirming access without acknowledging what he had seen. He could feel the invisible pressure building, the sense that eyes might already be on him. This knowledge wasn't supposed to be uncovered by an intern. It wasn't supposed to be uncovered at all. He exported anonymized datasets to run further analysis, careful to mask his digital footprint. The results were devastating. Over a 15-year span, minority employees were promoted at less than half the rate of their white counterparts, with equivalent performance metrics. Bonus distributions followed the same pattern. Attrition rates were higher. Exit interviews cited vague dissatisfaction that now read like coded despair. The system had not only shaped careers, it had rewritten lives. Xavier thought about the applause again. How easily people had clapped, relieved that the discomfort wasn't theirs. How many of them had benefited from this invisible hand without ever knowing its source? How many had suspected something was wrong and chosen not to look? Another message arrived, this time not from IT. Human resources. The subject line was casual, almost friendly. Quick check-in. The body of the message thanked Xavier for his initiative and enthusiasm, and requested that he stop by the HR director's office the following morning for a brief conversation. No explanation, no agenda, just a calendar invite already placed on his schedule. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Xavier closed his laptop slowly, the weight of the night settling over him. He had uncovered something vast, something engineered to persist precisely because it was invisible. And now the institution that had built it was aware, at least partially, that someone had looked too closely. As he stepped out into the cold night, the city lights blurred slightly, not from exhaustion but from the realization pressing against him. This wasn't just about a denied bonus anymore. It wasn't even about him. It was about a lie wrapped in tradition, protected by silence, and enforced by code that never slept. He checked his phone once more. No new messages. No reassurance. Just the HR invite sitting there, polite and ominous, like a door closing softly before it locked. As Xavier prepares for the HR meeting, his system access suddenly freezes, locked out entirely, and his phone buzzes with a final notification. Report to HR immediately. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than it should have, each second stretching thin with anticipation. Xavier stood alone, watching the digital numbers crawl upward, while his reflection stared back at him from the mirrored walls. He looked calm, but inside, his thoughts were racing ahead of the doors, rehearsing explanations, weighing risks, anticipating traps. The system lockout from the night before still hadn't lifted. Every credential he tried that morning had returned the same cold response. Access denied. Whatever conversation awaited him upstairs was not going to be informal. When the elevator opened, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The executive floor was quieter, carpeted thick enough to swallow footsteps, walls lined with framed black and white photographs of the company's early days. Almost every face in those frames was white, male, confident, staring into a future they had already decided would belong to them. Xavier followed the signs toward human resources, passing glass offices where senior staff glanced up briefly, curiosity flickering across their faces before professionalism snapped it shut. The HR director's office was spacious but deliberately warm, decorated with neutral art and soft lighting designed to put people at ease. It had the opposite effect on Xavier. Sitting behind the wide oak desk was Marlene Whitaker, a woman in her late 50s with perfectly arranged silver hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She gestured for him to sit, her tone polite, almost maternal, as if they were about to discuss career growth rather than his potential erasure. She began by thanking him for his contributions to the company, praising his intelligence, his work ethic, his impressive initiative. The compliments came smoothly, rehearsed, creating a cushion that made what followed feel even more calculated. Then her voice shifted, just slightly, into something firmer. She mentioned concerns, boundaries, protocols. She said words like curiosity and enthusiasm could sometimes cross into risk if not properly guided. Xavier listened carefully, responding with measured clarity. He explained that his analysis work had been exploratory, that he had not altered any systems, that his intent had been to understand performance discrepancies. Marlene nodded as he spoke, taking notes, but her expression remained unchanged. When he finished, she folded her hands and informed him that an internal review had flagged his activity as accessing privileged files outside his assigned scope. The accusation hung in the air, sterile and heavy. She told him that while no final decision had been made, the company took data integrity very seriously. That interns especially were expected to understand their place. The phrase landed harder than it should have. Understand their place. It echoed Douglas Hargrove's words from the ceremony, reshaped into HR language. The message was the same. Marlene leaned back slightly and warned him that continued overstepping could result in immediate termination of his internship, potentially impacting future employment opportunities. She framed it as concern for his career, advising him to focus on assigned tasks and leave structural matters to senior leadership. When Xavier asked directly whether the algorithm he had reviewed was under investigation for bias, her pen paused for just a fraction of a second before moving again. She told him that the company regularly audited its systems and found them compliant with all regulations. Her tone suggested the matter was closed. When he pressed gently, pointing out statistical disparities, she reminded him that correlation did not equal causation and cautioned against drawing conclusions without context. Context in this case seemed to mean hierarchy. The meeting ended without resolution. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just a thinly veiled warning, and a reminder of how replaceable he was. Marlene stood, signaling the conversation was over, and offered him a practiced smile. She said she hoped he would take this as a learning experience. As Xavier stood to leave, his eyes drifted to the corner of her desk, where a stack of papers lay partially covered by a leather folder. One document, angled just enough to be readable, caught his attention. The header bore the company logo, and the words Internal Ethics Review. Beneath it, a highlighted line referenced algorithmic bias exposure, an executive acknowledgement. His breath caught. The date on the memo was 5 years old. He did not stop, did not stare too long. But in that brief glance, everything rearranged itself. The company had known, long before him, long before this morning, long before Douglas Hargrove stood on that stage and spoke about legacy. They had identified the bias, documented it, and chosen to bury it under procedure and silence. Xavier walked out of the office with his posture intact, his expression neutral, but something inside him hardened. This was not ignorance. It was intent. The rest of the day passed in a blur. His badge still worked, but his system access remained restricted. Co-workers avoided his gaze, whispers trailing behind him as he moved through the office. News traveled fast in places like this, distorted by fear and self-preservation. By the time he packed up to leave, he could feel the isolation settling in, thick and deliberate. That evening, his apartment felt unusually quiet. The small space, normally a refuge, seemed to echo with the weight of the day. He set his bag down, kicked off his shoes, and stood still, listening. Nothing seemed out of place at first. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry, just the faint hum of the city outside. Then he walked into his bedroom. The light was on. Xavier was certain he had turned it off before leaving that morning. He took a cautious step forward, his senses sharpening. The room looked the same, bed neatly made, desk untouched, laptop closed where he had left it. But at the center of the bed, resting on the dark comforter like an accusation, was a single black hard drive. No label, no note, just the unmistakable mark of Hargrove Industries etched faintly on its side. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here, someone with access, someone who wanted him to see this. He stood there staring at the device, understanding immediately that whatever line he had been warned not to cross no longer existed. The company had tried to scare him into silence. Instead, someone inside it had chosen to push him further into the truth. Xavier reaches for the hard drive, realizing that the break-in wasn't meant to threaten him. It was meant to give him something the company never intended him to have. Xavier didn't touch the hard drive right away. For several minutes he stood at the edge of his bed, staring at it as if it might move. It wasn't fear that gripped him. Not exactly. It was the uneasy knowledge that once he connected that device, something irreversible would begin. The break-in hadn't rattled him as much as the silence that followed it. No broken windows, no stolen belongings, just a quiet message left in plain sight. We're watching, we know what you're after, and we're giving it to you anyway. He closed the blinds, unplugged his smart speakers, placed a piece of black tape over his laptop's camera, and booted the machine in offline mode. Then he inserted the hard drive. It took several seconds to mount. The screen flickered once, then displayed a single folder labeled Prometheus Core, a name he hadn't seen in any of the directories he'd accessed before. The file structure was meticulous: encrypted archives, internal documentation, and a user interface prototype for an internal tool called Predictive Growth Potential, PGP for short. What Xavier found next made his stomach knot. The PGP tool, according to its documentation, was designed in the early 2000s to assist HR and leadership in long-term strategic employee evaluation. It analyzed data points from resumes, performance metrics, peer reviews, psychometric tests, and even social interactions within the workplace. On paper, it was pitched as a visionary tool, a data-driven way to eliminate bias in hiring and promotions. But beneath the polished language lay a system far more sinister. He clicked into a folder labeled Beta, Deployment, First 5 years, and froze. There were thousands of employee records, each one assigned a numeric score. High scores had ascended rapidly. The lowest scores had either stagnated or quietly disappeared from the company altogether. At first, the logic of the algorithm seemed complex. It weighed over 200 variables. But the patterns emerged quickly, and they were damning. Names that flagged non-standard spelling received deductions. Degrees from HBCUs were marked as regional education, limited executive exposure. Profiles with volunteer experience in social justice organizations were tagged as political risk. Tone analysis of internal emails penalized overfamiliar language and excessive assertiveness, a metric that, when cross-referenced, disproportionately targeted Black employees who spoke candidly or directly. He scrolled through record after record, names he recognized, former co-workers, brilliant analysts, sharp designers, people who worked late, led projects, mentored interns, all ranked as low leadership potential. Xavier's hands trembled as he clicked open his own file. His performance metrics were flawless. His collaboration scores exceeded department averages. His final PGP score, 92. Exceptional. But right below it, a red override entry had been stamped just 3 weeks ago. Manual adjustment. Override to 54. Monitor for compliance. Limit promotion visibility. Justification: lack of cultural fit, non-alignment with legacy values. Xavier didn't breathe for several seconds. This wasn't a system failure. This wasn't human error. Someone, a real person, with access and authority, had seen his high score and decided he was still unworthy. The algorithm had seen him clearly, had recognized his talent, and the institution had smothered it. He opened the log file to see who had issued the override. The field was blank, but another entry had been left behind. It was a single comment, buried in the metadata. Too fast, too visible, keep beneath radar. He stared at the words, pulse pounding. His mind flooded with memories. The bonus ceremony, the hollow smiles, the patronizing HR lecture. It was all connected, not to his actions, but to his presence, to what he represented, to the threat that brilliance from the wrong background posed to the comfortable order Hargrove had spent decades constructing. The air in the room felt heavier now. Xavier pulled up a visualization script he had written earlier and ran it against the records. The graph generated in less than 10 seconds, a horrifying map of racial disparity inside Hargrove's walls. The system had been statistically eliminating Black and brown upward mobility for over 18 years, subtly, legally, quietly. Worse still, several audit reports showed that leadership had been aware of the bias for years. Emails buried deep in the archive referenced potential legal vulnerability if system metrics are disclosed. One report even proposed cosmetic adjustments, diversity visibility efforts, like featuring minority employees in promotional materials to distract from internal imbalances. They had tried to fix the optics, not the system. As the weight of what he had uncovered settled in his chest, Xavier leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just about a company. It was about a design, a mechanism dressed in data, and protocol that let powerful people maintain control while pretending progress. It was racism engineered into workflow, discrimination converted into numbers. He clicked through a few more entries, scanning through override logs. A pattern emerged: the same handful of user IDs issuing manual overrides, the same department heads, the same executives, all of them operating under plausible deniability, protected by the illusion of objectivity. Then something strange happened. The screen flickered. Once, then again. Xavier froze. He checked the hard drive, still running offline. No network activity. He double-checked his laptop settings. Airplane mode. Wi-Fi disabled. No Bluetooth. And then, without warning, the screen lit up with a brief green glow. The kind that only appeared when an application requested the camera. He jerked backward. The camera light blinked once. Then a pop-up appeared. Center screen. In a system font he didn't recognize. You shouldn't have seen this. Devier scrambled to shut the laptop but stopped himself. If they were watching, they already knew. Panic would only confirm vulnerability. Instead, he opened a secondary monitor, yanked out the hard drive, and ran a deep scan to check for remote access points. Nothing. No malware. No Trojan. This wasn't coming from the drive. It was coming from somewhere inside the laptop. Embedded, pre-installed, like a surveillance tool, native to the company's issued machines. He cursed under his breath, recalling now how IT had once asked all employees to install a security compliance update just weeks ago. At the time, no one questioned it. The message vanished. The camera light turned off. Silence returned. But it was no longer comforting. It was the kind of silence that meant someone else had just exited the room. Digitally, invisibly, but with full knowledge of what he'd seen. Xavier sat still for a long moment, then reached for his phone, preparing to call the one person he wasn't sure he could trust but needed anyway. The anonymous IT contact who had sent the first email. Before he could dial, his phone screen lit up with a new notification. Unknown number. You're in deeper than you think. Stop now. Xavier stares at the message, and then hears a knock at his door, slow and deliberate. The knock on the door was too soft to belong to law enforcement, too deliberate to be a neighbor. Xavier stood still, the glow of the laptop screen casting a pale halo in the darkened apartment. He didn't move for the first few seconds, barely breathing, eyes locked on the door as if it might open on its own. The warning text, "You're in deeper than you think. Stop now," still pulsed on his phone screen. No name, no number, just pressure, disguised as a suggestion. When the knock came again, slightly louder, Xavier backed away slowly, retrieved the hard drive from his desk, and slid it into a metal lockbox under his bed. The kind you buy when you grow up, knowing that anything valuable in your life might be taken without warning. He didn't answer the door. He waited, listening. After 30 seconds, the footsteps retreated. Silence returned. That night, Xavier couldn't sleep. The hard drive's contents replayed in his mind in relentless loops. Faces, files, numbers. The override on his own record. The eerie live camera feed. And the twisted poetry of a system that had quietly erased the future of so many black and brown employees, while painting itself as objective progress. By 4 a.m. Xavier was fully dressed, pacing his small apartment, wired and exhausted. He couldn't go to the press. Not yet. He had no legal protection, no allies inside the company. One misstep could not only ruin him, but bury the truth for good. But silence was no longer an option. Every second that passed felt complicit. He turned back to his laptop, this time on a secure personal machine, one he'd built himself before starting the internship. Air-gapped, untraceable. He connected to a public Wi-Fi outside a 24-hour diner using a virtual machine, and activated a burner email. Then, with trembling fingers, he created a new account on an encrypted whistleblower forum under the alias System Ghost. He took his time redacting personal information from the files. Names of low-level employees were removed. Metadata scrubbed, but the evidence remained chilling. Internal memos, algorithm schematics, override logs, and visualizations of the racial discrepancies baked into the company's AI. His opening line was short and deliberate. What if your success was erased by math? Before you even stepped in the room, he hit post. Then he waited. For an hour, nothing happened. Just a few views. A few curious comments. But then someone reposted it on a major tech subreddit. Another user translated the graphs and ran their own analysis. A Twitter thread exploded with screenshots, and just like that, System Ghost went viral. By noon, the leak had been shared by a former data ethics lead at another Fortune 500 company. By 2, a popular journalist tweeted, "If what System Ghost posted is real, this isn't just racism. This is digital redlining, corporate style." Xavier sat at his kitchen table, staring at the avalanche he'd just triggered. Anonymous messages flooded the forum. Former and current Hargrove employees began replying. Some confirmed the internal culture. Others shared vague but supportive responses. A few tried to discredit the leak, but the data spoke louder than words. Still, no one knew it was Xavier. Not his roommate, Darren. A law student who assumed Xavier had just stayed up all night studying. Not his mentor from Syracuse, who had texted earlier to ask if Xavier had managed to weather the bonus snub. The duality was strange, being the invisible spark behind a public fire. Then came the company's response. Hargrove Industries released a statement by mid-afternoon. We are aware of the false and defamatory allegations circulating online. Attributed to an anonymous source, we suspect the involvement of a disgruntled former employee in our pursuing legal recourse. Our commitment to diversity and ethical AI remains unwavering. The message was clinical, aggressive, dismissive. But Xavier knew what it really meant. They were scared, and they had no idea where the leak had come from. Not yet. He watched from behind his screen as journalists dissected the evidence. Tech influencers broke down the algorithm in 60-second explainers. Civil rights groups demanded investigations. Xavier felt a sense of surreal detachment, like watching a film he'd written, playing out in real time. Then his phone buzzed with an email that made his chest seize. Subject: Urgent, interview request from Global Eye News tonight. From producers @globaleye. Message: Dear System Ghost, we are reaching out in the hopes of conducting a live interview with you, or a voice masked proxy during tonight's 9 p.m. segment. Our anchor Naomi Redford would like to speak directly with the whistleblower behind the Hargrove AI leak. We're offering full anonymity, VPN reroutes, and legal support through our partner network. Please respond within 2 hours if interested. He read it twice. Global Eye wasn't just a news outlet. It was one of the top 3 media platforms in the country. Fearless, independent, and infamous for hosting whistleblowers from inside big tech, big pharma, and the political world. This wasn't some blogger or internet personality. This was the real stage, and they were asking him to step on it. Tonight, Xavier stood frozen in his kitchen, the phone still in his hand, as the weight of the offer settled into his bones. He had been anonymous for less than 24 hours. The post had barely matured, and already, it had broken through the noise of the internet and reached the national conversation. The safe thing to do was decline, stay in the shadows, let the evidence speak. But something in his chest, something he had been trying to quiet since that bonus ceremony, began to chew again. Not rage, not revenge, something heavier, older, the weight of all the names in those files, all the careers ended by invisible red lines, all the people who never got a platform. He replied with a single sentence: I'll speak, but not as a ghost. Moments later, as he prepares for the interview, his roommate walks in and casually asks, Yo man, have you seen this whistleblower dude? Sounds a lot like something you'd do. The apartment felt smaller once the decision had been made. Xavier sat at the edge of the couch, laptop closed, phone face down on the coffee table, as if any device might betray him with sound. Darren's offhand joke still lingered in the air from earlier, light and unknowing, a reminder of how thin the wall was between anonymity and exposure. Xavier had smiled it off, said nothing, retreated inward. Now the hourglass had turned. The interview was scheduled. The clock was moving. He stood and paced, rehearsing what he would say and what he would never say. Global Eye's producers had been meticulous. Layers of anonymity, voice modulation, a private entrance, legal counsel on standby. They spoke in calm assurances, as if systems could be trusted to protect people who threatened other systems. Xavier wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that truth, once spoken loudly enough, could shield the person who spoke it. The burner phone rang at 6:17. The voice said it admired courage, said it respected initiative, said the internet had a short memory, and so did institutions. If people knew when to step back, then it pivoted, smoothly, like a blade turning in a hand. It mentioned an address in Syracuse. His mother's. It recited the landlord's name, the month-to-month lease, the arrears from last winter, when the heat went out and repairs had swallowed savings. It suggested gently that evictions were unfortunate, but common, and that paperwork could move very quickly when attention was drawn to the right lines. The voice didn't raise itself. It didn't threaten directly. It offered a condition. Stay silent, or watch consequences ripple outward to the people who had never asked for this. Xavier said nothing. The silence stretched until the voice filled it again, reminding him that institutions protected themselves first, and that interns were easily replaced. The call ended without goodbye. He stood there for a long time after the line went dead, the phone still pressed to his ear, the room buzzing with the absence of sound. The threat was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic. It was a ledger entry waiting to be approved. The second blow landed an hour later, softer but deeper. An email arrived from his college's Office of Student Conduct, flagged urgent. The subject line was antiseptic and devastating. Notice of complaint and interim measures. The body explained that a formal allegation of harassment had been filed against him by an unnamed complainant. Pending investigation, certain restrictions would apply. Temporary suspension from campus facilities, advisement to refrain from public appearances, a reminder that retaliation would result in disciplinary action. Xavier read it twice, then a third time, parsing the language for mercy that wasn't there. The accusation was vague by design, a silhouette that could not be confronted. He understood immediately what it was meant to do. It didn't have to stick. It only had to slow him down, to cloud the narrative, to seed doubt. He called the number listed at the bottom and left a message, his voice steady, asking for details. No one called back. Messages followed. His academic advisor wrote, careful and concerned, suggesting they postpone upcoming recommendations until things were clarified. A department administrator forwarded the interim measures with a note about compliance. The machinery of consequence was already humming, each part doing its job without asking why. Xavier sat back down and closed his eyes. The timeline compressed in his mind. The ceremony, the files, the leak, the call. The escalation wasn't random. It was calibrated. He had crossed from being a problem to being a person they intended to break. A producer from Global Eye checked in to confirm arrival time. Xavier typed a response, deleted it, typed again. He thought of his mother's laugh, the way it always rose at the end like she was daring the world to keep up. He thought of the names in the files, the scores overridden with a keystroke, the futures nudged into invisibility. He thought of the memo on Marlene Whitaker's desk, the knowledge buried because it was inconvenient. He texted his mother a simple question about dinner plans, forcing normalcy into the space between fear and resolve. She replied with a heart and a joke about leftovers. He swallowed and stood. On the ride to the studio, the city blurred past the car window, neon and glass folding into each other. Global Eye's security protocol was efficient, impersonal, a private entrance, a wristband, a short walk through a corridor where the walls were lined with framed headlines from other nights, when secrets had found daylight. A producer spoke softly about timing, about cues, about breathing through the first question. Xavier nodded, absorbing without committing. In a small prep room, a technician adjusted the voice modulator, explaining how it would lower and mask his tone. Xavier tested it, heard himself come back unfamiliar, a version of him shaped for survival. The technician smiled, said it worked perfectly. Xavier didn't return the smile. Another call came to the burner phone. This time, the voice was different, cooler, impatient. It referenced the college complaint, as if it were a courtesy, a reminder that consequences could multiply. It asked if he was ready to be reasonable. Xavier ended the call. The anchor, Naomi Redford, appeared briefly in the doorway, introducing herself with a grip that was firm without being possessive. Her eyes were alert, curious, calibrated for truth and spectacle in equal measure. She said she had read everything twice. She said the data was solid. She asked if he was safe. Xavier said he was ready. The studio lights were brighter than he expected. The set was clean, modern, designed to look transparent. Cameras hovered like patient insects. The countdown ticked in his peripheral vision. 5 minutes. 2, 30 seconds. Xavier centered himself on the chair, shoulders squared, hands folded to still them. As the broadcast went live, Naomi opened with context, what the leak alleged, why it mattered, how algorithmic bias could operate without a single slur ever being spoken. Xavier listened to his work refracted through her words, the story stepping out of him and into the room. Then she turned toward him. Her first questions were measured, inviting explanation without exposure. He answered carefully, describing systems, incentives, patterns. He spoke of numbers because numbers were harder to dismiss. The voice modulator rendered him anonymous, but the conviction carried through. Halfway through the segment, Naomi paused. The control room whispered into her earpiece. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for Xavier to notice. She nodded once, then reached for a tablet on the desk. She said there had been questions online, claims, counterclaims. She said transparency mattered. Then she lifted the tablet and turned it toward the camera. On the screen was a photograph. Xavier's photograph. Not a candid, Not a grainy get, a clean image pulled from a professional profile, cropped and centered. His face looked back at him from a distance, calm and unmistakable. The room seemed to tilt. Naomi's voice cut through the air, precise and controlled. She asked, for the record, whether the image she was holding belonged to the person behind the voice on the screen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequences waiting to be chosen. Naomi holds the photo steady and asks, "Is this the real system ghost?" The silence in the studio after Naomi's question wasn't just a pause. It was a test. The kind that separates ghosts from men. Xavier could hear his own heartbeat through the voice modulator. Could feel the weight of the country watching from behind the black lens of the main camera. The photo on the tablet stared back at him with quiet defiance, as if daring him to choose anonymity now. After everything, he didn't look at Naomi. He didn't look at the camera. He looked inward. To the moment he'd stood alone during the bonus ceremony. To the memo on Marlene's desk. To the override in his file that branded him as a threat in the most calculated way. Too fast. Too visible. The algorithm had erased his excellence. The system had tried to rewrite his worth. And now they had handed him a choice. Hide and survive, or stand and disrupt. He leaned slightly forward. "Yes," he said, voice modulated, but unwavering. "That's me." The air in the studio tightened, then released like a held breath. Naomi nodded once, slowly, as if confirming not just a name, but a new chapter. The producers in the control room froze. Twitter ignited before the broadcast even cut to break. Xavier Miles had stepped out of the shadows. By midnight, the clip had been shared 2.3 million times. By morning it had tripled. The headline flashed across news tickers and phones alike. Whistleblower reveals racial bias engineered into corporate AI. The image of his face, once unknown, now filled thumbnails beside trending hashtags. System Ghost is real. And erase the algorithm surged across platforms. And Xavier's name became a rallying cry not for fame, but for reckoning. The internet, unpredictable and vicious, did something it rarely did. It listened. Protest formed within 48 hours, not just outside Hargrove Industries' pristine Manhattan headquarters, but across campuses, coding boot camps and community centers. Former Hargrove employees, mostly black and brown professionals, who had once assumed their failed promotions were personal shortcomings, came forward. They told stories in comments, videos, podcasts. Their words added flesh and heartbreak to the skeleton Xavier had exposed. "I led 2 teams, trained my manager, and never made it past junior associate. I got perfect evaluations, until I started speaking up. I thought it was just me." One by one, they validated what Xavier had proven with code. Racism didn't need slurs or closed doors anymore. It lived in formulas, in pattern recognition, in quiet digital decisions, dressed as progress. The pressure mounted quickly. Hargrove's internal PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing blanket denials, promising audits, blaming legacy code from a previous vendor. But the damage was done. The data had been too clean, the overrides too deliberate, the silence from leadership too long. Then Douglas Hargrove stepped into the spotlight, not with humility, but defiance. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stood flanked by legal counsel and flinty-eyed executives. The room was sterile, controlled, and broadcast live. "We will not be intimidated," he said, his voice measured, disdain veiled only thinly beneath professionalism. "We are a company of builders, of visionaries, of legacy. What we will not do is apologize for excellence, or allow a disgruntled intern with a chip on his shoulder to define our future." The phrase landed like a slap. Disgruntled intern. As if Xavier's story was irritation, not injustice. As if exposing systemic bias was some personal vendetta. The comment lit another fuse. Within hours, major tech figures, CEOs, activists, investors, publicly condemned Hargrove's dismissiveness. A black founder of a rival AI firm tweeted, "If your algorithm needs to erase black talent to protect your legacy was always broken." The clip of Douglas's press conference was looped endlessly, a contrast to Xavier's calm confession. The country split into familiar camps, defenders of the meritocracy myth versus those who knew from lived experience that merit had never been distributed equally. Amid the noise, Xavier stayed quiet. He didn't post. He didn't explain. He spent those first days fielding calls from civil rights attorneys, privacy watchdogs, and exhausted former interns who just wanted to say, "Thank you." Then, 5 days after the interview aired, a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. Subject: subpoena. For testimony. Party: Xavier Miles. Case reference: Federal Inquiry into Hargrove Industries. Algorithmic discrimination. The second line confirmed what the world had suspected was coming. Douglas Hargrove was under formal federal investigation. But what the letter also revealed was that Xavier would no longer be a whisper in a thread. He was now a material witness, and he would need to appear before a grand jury. Xavier sat in his apartment, the letter in his lap, and felt the full gravity of the moment pull at him. This wasn't a post anymore. This wasn't a leak. This was law. Federal scrutiny, possible perjury, reputations on the line. If he misstepped now, everything he built could collapse. Not just the case, but the credibility of every voice that followed him. He reached for his phone. Before he could unlock it, another notification slid across the screen. Unknown sender. They'll come for your mother next. You've been warned. The screen dimmed before he could react. As Xavier prepares to enter federal protection for the hearing, a package arrives on his doorstep. Inside, a shredded copy of his college acceptance letter marked in red ink. UN. The boardroom atop Hargrove Tower sat like a penthouse war chamber. Floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, city lights sprawling far below like a conquered kingdom. But inside, the mood was anything but triumphant. The silence was thick, broken only by the low hum of air conditioning, and the shuffle of papers being reviewed with clenched jaws. Douglas Hargrove stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, tie loosened but voice razor-sharp. "We let a child become a national symbol," he said, seething. "And now we are on trial in the court of public opinion, because no one here had the foresight to keep a lid on a 23-year-old intern with a martyr complex." Around the table sat 12 board members, a curated mix of tech pioneers, old money industrialists, and private equity hawks. Many looked uncomfortable. A few looked enraged. But no one dared challenge the authority radiating from Douglas. He had built this company from an idea scribbled on a bar napkin. Now that empire was being rattled by an intern from a city no one at this table could point to a map. "Legal has confirmed DOJ's request for internal documents," said an executive vice president. "If Miles turns over that drive, we're looking at potential civil rights violations going back 2 decades. Maybe more. He's already leaked most of it." Another board member muttered. "No." Douglas snapped. "What he leaked was what we wanted him to find." Confused glances circled the table. Douglas explained. There were versions of the Prometheus algorithm, iterations, test forks, legacy clones. The version Xavier had leaked was damning. Yes, but there were worse versions, buried deeper, protected under layers of dummy code and legal compartmentalization. Versions that didn't just predict outcomes, but quietly recommended terminations based on cultural volatility. If the drive he held was that drive, and it got into federal hands, it wouldn't just burn Hargrove Industries. It would pull in partnerships, subsidiaries, entire investor networks. "So what's the strategy?" asked one board member. "We can't make him disappear." Douglas didn't blink. "No, but we can make people stop listening." He reached for a sealed manila envelope and slid it onto the table. "Juvenile records," he said flatly. "Sealed, but not impossible to access when you know the right hands to shake." Inside were photocopies, grainy black and white police logs, foster system evaluations, a psychologist's note from when Xavier was 13, displays anti-authority behavior, struggles with trust. The silence broke like glass. "You're proposing character assassination," someone said cautiously. "I'm proposing survival," Douglas replied coldly. "We don't need to destroy him. We just need to tarnish the myth. Make people second-guess the story. Raise the question, what else isn't he telling us?" There was pushback, but muted. Morality was a weak argument in rooms like this. The vote passed, unofficially. A private PR firm was already on standby, ready to feed the documents anonymously to online investigative channels with subtle nudges about a troubled past and emotional instability. The goal was clear: frame Xavier not as a whistleblower, but a fractured young man, looking for someone to blame. Meanwhile, across the city, Xavier sat in a stark federal office, fingers laced, facing 2 government investigators who had no interest in headlines or hashtags. They spoke in terms of admissibility, of evidence chains, and federal codes. The walls were bare, but the atmosphere was dense, with consequence. "We know what's on the drive," said one agent, a black woman with decades of quiet weight in her voice. "We also know there's more than what you released. You haven't handed over everything." Xavier didn't deny it. He didn't need to. The second agent leaned forward. You understand what happens if you withhold data from a federal subpoena? Xavier met his gaze. Do you understand what happens if that data reveals violations beyond your mandate? The room went still. Xavier wasn't just protecting himself. He was holding a firewall between the truth and chaos. The drive contained more than just proof of algorithmic discrimination. Buried within were spreadsheets and reports tied to offshore payments, hidden contracts with surveillance firms, experimental employee monitoring tech that violated multiple international labor laws. If he handed everything over now, without strategy, it wouldn't just sink Hargrove. It could collapse companies whose names hadn't even been mentioned yet. One of the agents sat back, folding his arms. You're playing a dangerous game. I didn't build the game, Xavier said quietly. I just stopped pretending it wasn't rigged. There was a pause. Then the lead agent nodded once and slid a form across the table, an agreement outlining whistleblower protections, contingent on full disclosure. Xavier didn't sign it. Not yet. He needed time. Not to stall, but to plan, because trust wasn't free. And then, as the meeting ended and Xavier stood to leave, one of the board members from Hargrove's empire, a woman in her late 40s, dressed in elegant gray, quiet throughout the earlier chaos, entered the building. He recognized her immediately. Claire Delaney. Their eyes met in passing, but nothing in her face betrayed recognition, until in the waiting area. As Xavier moved past her toward the elevator, she reached beneath the fold of her coat and slipped something into his hand. A business card, blank on one side. On the back, in small handwriting, they're hiding more than you think. Call me. As Xavier reads the card, a call buzzes his phone from the college dean's office. There's been a new complaint, the voice says. And it's not just academic anymore. The voice from the college dean's office had been polite, but its undertone carried something heavier than protocol. Xavier held the phone to his ear as the administrator read the new complaint. This one not from a student, but from a concerned third party. It alleged academic dishonesty tied to Xavier's internship, suggesting his code work had been inappropriately obtained and violated the university's external research ethics. The administrator apologized as if that softened anything. There would be a formal review, they said, a hold on his degree status, possibly even expulsion. As the call ended, Xavier sat motionless in the corner of the lobby, Claire's business card, still resting in his other hand, like it had heat of its own. He flipped it back and forth, staring at her delicate handwriting. They're hiding more than you think. Call me. It wasn't just a message. It was a tether, a reminder that not every suit at Hargrove Tower was complicit, even if most were silent. That evening, they met in the back room of a nearly empty art gallery in the Lower East Side, a private space Claire often used when she needed to avoid being seen. She wore a black wool coat and no makeup, her usual confidence subdued into something colder, sharper. I knew you'd show, she said quietly, as she poured herself a glass of water from a decanter on a side table. People like you never get to bluff. Not in this country. Xavier didn't respond to the insult disguised as truth. He just waited. Claire sat down across from him and folded her hands. I saw what they voted on. The smear campaign. The sealed records. It made me sick. Why didn't you stop it? I tried, she said. They listened just long enough to say they'd take it under advisement. That's corporate speak for shut up before we make you regret it. Xavier leaned forward slightly. Why now? Why me? For the first time, Claire's composure faltered. She took a breath, choosing her words with uncharacteristic care. My sister worked here. Danielle. Brilliant. First in her class at Spelman. Joined our predictive analytics team in 2011. Outperformed everyone. But she never got promoted past coordinator level. She trained people who leapfrogged over her. White people. Less experienced. Less talented. Xavier recognized the story before she even finished it. 3 years ago, she had a breakdown, resigned without notice, moved back home. She doesn't touch tech anymore. Won't even use a smartphone. There was a pause. Claire looked away, blinking fast. I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was being dramatic. I told her to toughen up. It's corporate, I said. You have to be patient. But it wasn't about patience, Xavier said, voice low. It was about math. About being filtered out before she even got the chance. Claire nodded slowly, her expression grim. And I let it happen. Xavier didn't offer comfort. He wasn't here for redemption arcs. But he recognized something rare in her voice. Accountability. I can get you into the secure backups, Claire said. The real ones. The ones the DOJ subpoena didn't reach. Why? Xavier asked, narrowing his eyes. You're not just doing this for your sister. Claire gave a dry, humorless smile. No. I'm doing it because I'm tired. Tired playing dumb to keep my seat at the table. She handed him a USB key and a small laminated security badge with the Hargrove emblem. You'll need to go in after hours. The terminal is air-gapped and monitored, but if you follow the instructions exactly, you'll bypass the audit logs. This could destroy your career, Xavier said. Claire shrugged. It already did. I just haven't turned in my badge yet. They parted ways outside the gallery without a word. The street was wet from recent rain, and Claire disappeared into the mist, like someone walking away from a life she no longer wanted to defend. Later that night, Xavier stood at the back entrance of Hargrove Tower, using Claire's badge to pass through the biometric lock. The building was eerily quiet, long corridors bathed in dimmed security lights, the usual hum of productivity replaced by something almost funereal. The server room was located 2 floors below the basement, accessible only through a coded stairwell that Claire had warned him about. No elevators, a log usage. The air in the server chamber was cold and sterile. Walls of machines blinked in the dark, steady and lifeless, unaware they were being hunted. He approached the designated terminal, inserted the USB key, and entered the sequence Claire had written on the back of the business card. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the monitor flickered to life, revealing a new layer of directories, files labeled with innocuous names, but flagged with internal tags. Blacklist 10Y, Legacy Patch R, Evil Override Chain. His breath caught. This was it. Not just bias, but orchestration. Preemptive protocols to cap minority advancement, even when other metrics suggested leadership potential. A silent quota system that never called itself one. As he navigated deeper, a warning screen flashed. Attention, scheduled purge in progress. A countdown timer appeared. Xavier's stomach dropped. The system was preparing to auto-wipe. All backups, all logs, everything. And it had just started. As Xavier rushes to intercept the purge, a second timer appears on screen labeled Legal Archive Self-Destruct, triggered by remote admin. And it's counting down faster. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was screaming. Xavier stared at the 2 timers blinking on the terminal. One for the system-wide purge scheduled in 24 hours. The other for the legal archive set to auto-destruct in less than 4. A red bar traced beneath each countdown like a fuse racing toward detonation. He didn't need to ask why. Someone had triggered the command remotely. Someone knew he had found the vault, and someone was willing to burn the entire truth rather than let it survive. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He initiated a shadow copy, redirected the data stream to a mobile extraction drive, nested inside the air gap. Claire had shown him. The system resisted, encrypting certain paths mid-transfer, trying to block him with built-in firewalls. But Xavier wasn't just decoding, he was improvising. He redirected through a legacy debugging port, and rerouted the power source to prevent emergency shutdown. Still, it wasn't enough. There were too many files, too much data. He couldn't do it alone. He stepped out of the server room, and activated the burner phone Claire had given him. She answered instantly, her voice sharp and alert, as if she hadn't slept since their last meeting. They've triggered the remote wipe, Xavier said without breathing. I need backup. Claire's reply was fast. Where are you exactly? Sub-basement terminal, node 42A. I'm on my way. He hung up and returned to the server chamber, initiating a second cloning process on a parallel drive. The servers hummed louder now, as if aware of their own impending death. Lights flickered. Somewhere above them, the building's internal systems had begun cycling into lockdown mode. Doors locking with mechanical clicks, elevators disabled. Even the airflow changed. By the time Claire arrived, the timer on the legal archive had dropped to 2 hours. She wore a janitor's uniform, the kind of neutral gray that passed through security without notice. Her hair was tucked under a cap, badge clipped at an angle, face blank. She handed Xavier a second uniform, and an ID card forged using a real employee's template. We're not ghosts anymore, she muttered. But we still have to vanish. They moved together, working in practiced rhythm. Claire handled the directory labeling, while Xavier focused on decrypting files that had been deliberately mislabeled to disguise their true contents. Buried within were files tagged DLH private, initials that stood for Douglas Lee Hargrove, and inside those folders were direct communications, handwritten notes scanned into PDFs, and a chilling document titled Exec privilege, performance-based ejection framework. It wasn't just a purge, it was a playbook. Every year, following the annual review cycle, the algorithm would flag high-performing minority employees. Those who outpaced expected thresholds were quietly suppressed, either redirected into roles with no upward mobility, or targeted for attrition using vague HR write-ups. Bonus deletions were automated, promotions blocked. In most cases, the employees were forced out within 6 months, often with severance packages that included NDAs. Their departure statistics were marked as voluntary. Claire read the file in silence, then whispered, "We built this. We called it innovation. Then we called it fair," Xavier added. Footsteps outside the hallway made them freeze. Claire killed the monitor light. They waited, breath tight in their chests, as 2 security guards walked past, murmuring about a malfunction in Sector B. Xavier checked the system logs. Security protocols were tightening every minute. The building's AI had flagged their activity as a breach, even without knowing who they were. They had to move faster. But then came the alert. Building-wide lockdown initiated. Level 3 containment. A female voice echoed from the intercom above. Calm. Robotic. Due to an ongoing cybersecurity threat. Hargrove Tower is now in lockdown. All personnel, please remain in your current locations. Emergency response is en route. Claire turned pale. They've gone live. They know someone's inside. Doors slammed shut across the sublevels. Keypads disabled. Entry logs frozen. They were trapped. Xavier checked the network ports. We've still got power. Still connected, but if they cut physical access to the drives, then everything we've copied dies in here with us. They split tasks. Xavier compressed the essential directories into a single encrypted archive. Claire activated a third backup key that initiated upload to a remote satellite location. A digital dead man's switch, buried inside an academic journal's draft server. It wasn't secure, but it was far enough outside Hargrove's control to serve as an emergency release point. Even if we don't get out, Claire said, her voice hoarse, this story does. But Xavier wasn't ready to give up the original files. The raw data, the forensic proof, the kind of evidence no legal department could spin or redact. And as he ran one final scan through the archive, he found a folder buried deeper than the rest. One not included in the primary index. Its name was strange. BDP, Override History. He clicked it open. Inside was a single file. Bonus to deal protocol. Claire turned to him slowly, reading the fanline over his shoulder. You've got to be kidding me. The document was long, detailed, dated over a decade ago, and stamped confidential under Douglas Hargrove's direct authorization. It wasn't algorithmic, it was manual. An annual directive that ensured minority employees scoring above a certain percentile would be flagged for bonus realignment, a euphemism for deletion from payout queues. The policy had been reviewed annually, signed off by multiple department heads, and even incorporated into HR training materials in codeword form. And worst of all, it referenced government contracts. Xavier stared at the line near the bottom of the page. In order to preserve uniform optics across federal contract divisions, all discretionary payouts should reflect continuity with legacy demographic ratios. It was no longer just about injustice. It was fraud, a deliberate deception aimed at manipulating diversity reports sent to federal partners. A felony offense under multiple statutes. Claire backed away from the screen. They've committed financial fraud against the US government. That's not just a PR disaster. That's prison. Xavier reached for the encrypted drive, his hand trembling slightly. Then we finish this. All of it. As they prepare to initiate the final transfer, the server screen goes black, and a single new line of text appears. Override initiated. Manual lockdown. Identify yourself. The room seemed to hold its breath. As the screen went dark, the servers around them continued their low mechanical hum, indifferent to the moment. But Xavier felt the shift immediately, the sense that someone had taken control, not of the system, but of the story. The new line of text pulsed once, then steadied. Override initiated. Manual lockdown. Identify yourself. It wasn't an automated warning. It was a demand, a human one. Claire swallowed hard. That's not security AI, she said. That's executive access. Xavier didn't respond. He reopened the terminal through a backdoor shell he'd prepared minutes earlier, rerouting the display to a secondary monitor while leaving the main screen frozen on the challenge prompt. It bought them time, seconds, maybe minutes, but enough. He pulled the file open again, scrolling through it slowly this time, forcing himself to absorb every line. The document was written in the language of plausible deniability. No slurs, no explicit mention of race. Instead, it used phrases like discretionary realignment, legacy continuity, and cultural performance parity. But the annotations told the real story. Side notes clarified implementation thresholds. Tables broke down adjustment candidates by demographic clusters that aligned perfectly with racial data. Footnotes referenced prior years' success in containing anomalous advancement. At the bottom of every page was the same signature block, approved by Douglas L. Hargrove. Review cycle, annual. Xavier felt a strange calm settle over him. This was it. Not just evidence of bias, but proof of intent. The algorithm hadn't run amok. It had been leashed, directed, weaponized. The billionaire who had called him unworthy hadn't been improvising on that stage. He had been reciting doctrine. Claire leaned in, her voice barely audible. This isn't just civil liability. This is criminal conspiracy. Xavier nodded. And it's been happening every year. He initiated the upload. The Whistleblower Vault was a distributed system designed to survive takedowns. Fragments of encrypted data stored across academic institutions, nonprofit servers, and international legal repositories. Once the transfer began, it could not be recalled. Xavier selected the file, attached the supporting logs, and added a concise summary written in language that stripped away euphemism and left only fact. He sent parallel packets to 3 civil rights law firms, 2 investigative journalists with long records of protecting sources, and a federal oversight body that specialized in government contractor compliance. Each transmission carried its own key. Each recipient would receive enough to act, but not enough to bury the whole. The terminal chimed softly as the first confirmation arrived. Then another. Then a cascade. On the main monitor, the lockdown prompt flickered. A new message appeared. This one colder. Data transfer detected. Cease activity immediately. Xavier ignored it. The countdown on the purge timer continued to fall. But now it didn't matter. The truth was already leaving the building. Claire exhaled shakily, a sound somewhere between relief and grief. They're going to know it was me. They already do, Xavier said gently. But now they can't stop it. They didn't wait for the purge to complete. With the core files secured, Xavier initiated a controlled shutdown that corrupted the local index without touching the data already in transit. It would slow forensic reconstruction just enough to buy the story time to breathe. Then they moved. The lockdown ended not with alarms, but with silence. Doors unlocked in sequence. Elevators came back online. Somewhere above them, executives were likely scrambling, phones pressed to ears, trying to understand how the ground had shifted beneath their feet. By morning, the first lawsuit was filed. By noon, there were 12 more. Former employees whose bonuses had vanished without explanation came forward with documentation. Government agencies announced preliminary reviews of federal contracts tied to Hargrove Industries. Stock prices dipped, then slid, then fell hard as analysts revised risk assessments in real time. The phrase bonus delete protocol began trending, stripped of context but heavy with implication. Journalists published excerpts from the file with surgical precision. They highlighted the signatures, the dates, the pattern. No speculation, just receipts. Douglas Hargrove released a statement denying wrongdoing. Then another blaming rogue processes. Then a third accusing unnamed bad actors of sabotage. None of it slowed the momentum. The story had outgrown him. It no longer needed a villain to explain itself. The documents did that work on their own. Xavier watched the coverage from a quiet apartment arranged by legal counsel, his phone buzzing constantly with updates he barely read. His mother called once, voice shaking, asking what was happening on the news. He told her he was okay. He didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Late that afternoon, as cameras gathered outside Hargrove Tower and helicopters circled overhead, the news broke clean and unmistakable. Douglas Lee Hargrove had been arrested. The charges were read in a tone devoid of drama. Wire fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights statutes, falsification of federal compliance records. The image that followed, Douglas in a dark coat, jaw set, hands cuffed, burned itself into the national consciousness. For a moment it felt like an ending. It wasn't. By evening, Douglas had posted bail. He exited the courthouse without speaking, flanked by attorneys, eyes hard and focused. In a brief statement released through his legal team, he denied all allegations and promised to vigorously defend against this coordinated attack. The language was familiar now. Defensive, defiant, unrepentant. Xavier read the statement once and set the phone down. He knew that look. He had seen it in the boardroom photos, in the override comments, in the memo on Marlene's desk. Douglas Hargrove was not done. Men like him rarely were. As night fell, a final message arrived on Xavier's secure line. No sender, just text. You took something from me. I will take something from you. Xavier closed his eyes, steadying himself. The empire had cracked. The truth had escaped, but the cost was still unfolding. Hours later, as Douglas walks free on bail, a sealed envelope arrives for Xavier. Inside, a court notice that doesn't name Hargrove Industries at all, but Xavier Miles as the primary target. The envelope felt heavier than it looked. It arrived without fanfare. No knock at the door, no delivery confirmation, just tucked beneath the apartment door like an afterthought. Xavier bent down slowly, half expecting another warning, another threat veiled in civility. But this was different. It was stamped with the seal of the Southern District Court, his name printed clearly on the front. Xavier Miles, legal summons enclosed. Inside, it wasn't what he expected. The plaintiff wasn't Hargrove Industries. It was a third-party contractor, a data consultancy firm, allegedly tied to one of the now-leaked algorithms. They accused Xavier of unauthorized access, digital espionage, and damage to corporate intellectual property. The charges were civil, not criminal, but the timing wasn't coincidental. This wasn't about restitution. It was about punishment by attrition, bleeding him dry through legal warfare. Claire called that night. Her voice was taut. This is retaliation disguised as procedure, she said. They're testing the waters, trying to see if they can drag you under before you get your next breath. Xavier didn't respond immediately. His mind was already a step ahead, mapping the long game. The story was out. The documents were in the public domain. Hargrove's brand had hemorrhaged value, and public trust was vanishing by the hour. But none of that would matter if they reframed him as reckless, dangerous, ungrateful, the stereotype they always kept in their back pocket, ready to weaponize when a black man rose too far too fast with too much truth. But what they didn't anticipate was the country responding in kind. It started small. A podcast Xavier had never heard of released a 1-hour breakdown of the leak, laced with emotion, clarity, and rage. Then came the op-eds. Writers who had lived through similar corporate erasure penned essays that read like testimonies. Professors began assigning the leaked files in ethics classes. High school students quoted Xavier's lines in presentations. One clip, just 12 seconds of him saying, "I didn't break the system, I revealed it," became the centerpiece of a viral campaign. Then the invitations started pouring in. Tech summits, civil rights panels, university town halls, non-profit webinars. They didn't want a celebrity. They wanted clarity. Xavier accepted selectively, speaking when it mattered, never pandering. He didn't posture. He didn't seek applause. He told the story with calm precision and the kind of depth that made denial uncomfortable. Legacy is not talent, he said at a Boston University panel. Legacy is access dressed as tradition. Excellence, he told a group of graduating students, doesn't bend algorithms. It exposes them, and perhaps most striking of all, we don't want your seats. We want the floor rebuilt. His voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. It carried because it was undeniable. For every interview he gave, 1,000 messages arrived. Anonymous employees inside other tech giants started leaking. One offered code that showed similar ranking structures at another multinational. A former HR rep sent redacted performance review templates identical in style to Hargrove's. The system Xavier had exposed was not isolated. It was a blueprint replicated, normalized, justified. Each new revelation dragged Hargrove further into the abyss. The brand collapsed in stages. First came the investor exits. Then the client withdrawals. Government contracts were suspended pending review. Then came the wave of resignations. Not from guilt, but from fear. No one wanted to be the last one holding the bag when the dam finally burst. Douglas, however, refused to retreat. He re-emerged through a series of carefully staged interviews, now framing himself as the victim of cancel culture, insisting the files had been taken out of context, that Hargrove had merely been preserving standards in an era of corporate overcorrection. On a national podcast, he referred to Xavier by name and called him a woke virus infecting innovation. The backlash was immediate. But it didn't stop Douglas. It made him louder, bolder, more erratic. In one interview, he compared Xavier's actions to digital terrorism. In another, he claimed the algorithm was never meant to evaluate people, only potential. The legal team backpedaled after each quote. But the damage couldn't be contained. The court of public opinion had already shifted. Hargrove Industries wasn't just failing. It was rotting from the inside out. Amidst it all, Xavier remained focused. He worked with civil rights attorneys to push for algorithm transparency legislation. He met quietly with whistleblowers to help them navigate their own disclosures safely. He helped launch an independent AI ethics audit group, staffed by coders, lawyers, and ethicists from marginalized backgrounds. He didn't want revenge. He wanted transformation. Claire, though quieter publicly, had become his closest ally. They spoke almost daily now, sharing intel, strategy, worry. She had been suspended from the Hargrove board, pending internal review. But that review never came. Her badge stopped working one morning, and she never returned to the tower. Still, she didn't flinch. "We knew this wouldn't end clean," she told Xavier one night over the phone. "But I'd rather lose everything than look in the mirror and see silence." Then, suddenly, she went silent. It started with a missed call. Then two. Then a message from one of Xavier's legal contacts. Claire had been scheduled to speak at a closed-door compliance hearing, but never arrived. When they tried to trace her phone, it pinged once. At a private property owned by a Hargrove-affiliated security contractor, just outside the city, then went dark. No one could reach her. She didn't answer emails. Her apartment door was locked. Her car remained parked outside her building, and the gallery where she'd first met Xavier had been emptied overnight. Paintings removed, records deleted. He felt the weight of it immediately. This wasn't coincidence. It was containment. And this time, it wasn't just digital. Xavier receives a plain envelope, marked confidential inside, is a grainy photo of Claire, hands bound, seated in what looks like a concrete room. A single line is scrawled beneath. She knew when to stop. The photo haunted Xavier. It arrived inside a manila envelope slid under his apartment door at dawn. No postmark, no fingerprints. The paper smelled faintly of dust and bleach. Inside, a single grainy photograph. Claire Delaney, bound at the wrists, seated on a metal chair in a dim concrete room. Her head was tilted forward, but not unconscious. Alert. Watching. Waiting. Beneath the image, scrawled in red marker, 6 chilling words. She knew when to stop. "Do you?" Xavier sat at the kitchen table for an hour, the envelope spread open in front of him, untouched. His mind raced through every possibility. Was it staged? Was she coerced into posing? But the tension in her eyes, the subtle posture of resistance, the unmistakable concrete texture behind her, it all felt real, too real. He didn't go to the police. Not yet. He knew how corporate power worked. The photo wasn't meant to provoke legal action. It was psychological warfare, meant to splinter his resolve. But Xavier wasn't the same intern they'd once ignored at a podium. He'd stood at the center of a storm and remained upright. He wasn't going to back down now. He called Geneva Brandt, a civil rights attorney, who had quietly become his closest legal ally. She reviewed the image in silence. "This isn't amateur," she said. "They know what they're doing. This isn't about ransom. It's about control. Psychological threat. They want to make her a symbol." Xavier nodded. "Then we make her a symbol of something else." He hired a private investigator that night. Saul Vickerman, an ex-FBI forensic analyst, turned independent bloodhound with no love for billionaires and an even deeper hatred for corporate overreach. Saul worked fast. In 2 days, he traced the original ping of Claire's phone to a low-profile Hargrove-owned shell property, registered under a logistics subsidiary. The building was listed as equipment storage, but had no delivery records, no shipments, no activity on public books. "The walls have lead shielding," Saul said. "That's not to stop thieves. That's to stop detection." Through satellite analysis, heat signatures confirmed that at least one room remained actively powered at all times, despite no reports of employees on site. It was a black site in corporate clothing. Meanwhile, Xavier launched a coordinated campaign, subtle, precise, and weaponized with legal oversight. He didn't scream conspiracy online. He leaked concerns. He released the photo to a trusted civil rights watchdog, who blurred Claire's face, and published a piece titled, "What Happens When Whistleblowers Vanish." The public took the bait. Twitter erupted. Claire's name began trending. Protesters gathered outside Hargrove's subsidiary. Law students circulated her resignation letter and called her a modern-day tech dissenter. Under mounting scrutiny, Claire's image was forced back into the national conversation, not as a vanished traitor, but a vanished truth-teller. Geneva filed an emergency motion for judicial inquiry into Claire's disappearance, citing credible evidence of unlawful detainment by a private entity. Within hours, the Department of Labor opened a preliminary investigation. The press surrounded the Hargrove building by nightfall, demanding answers. And just like that, Claire came back. She appeared at 3:14 a.m., escorted to a public hospital by anonymous sources, disheveled, exhausted, but alive. No memory of how she got out, no confirmation of where she had been, but the bruises on her wrists told their own story. So did the tremble in her voice. As she stepped into the light, Xavier met her in a quiet recovery room. Away from cameras, she looked thinner. Her usually crisp demeanor faded into something raw. Still, her eyes held fire. "I was never supposed to leave," she whispered. "But someone inside still believes this place can burn." Xavier leaned in. "Did you get it?" She nodded slowly, reached into her hospital bag, and pulled out a small encrypted USB, worn, scratched, and marked with a strip of red tape. "They recorded everything," she said. "Every approval, every edit, every purge. And this is the one thing they never thought would resurface." Xavier plugged the USB into a secure laptop in the hospital room. Inside was a single file folder labeled DH Sign-Off Video. The footage played like a boardroom documentary. Douglas sitting at the head of the table, flanked by compliance and HR execs, flipping through a printed report titled Bonus Reevaluation Strategy. He didn't even hesitate. With a black fountain pen, he signed the cover page and said, "Make sure the optics stay clean. Diversity where we can see it, not where it counts." The room chuckled. Someone toasted. There it was, the racial purge order. On video. Signed. Spoken. Undeniable. Claire turned her face away. As it played, Xavier didn't. He needed to watch every second. Within an hour, Geneva transmitted the footage to the Department of Justice's Internal Review Board. They had been building a civil case, but this changed everything. This was intent. This was conspiracy. This was evidence that couldn't be unspun by PR firms or lawyer speak. By sunrise, the DOJ issued a formal statement. A second case had been opened. Criminal, federal, and personal. And they wanted Xavier back on the stand. As Xavier prepares to testify, he receives a final encrypted message from an unknown source. "Be careful what truth you carry. Not all of us want it freed." Xavier Miles had faced many rooms filled with quiet judgment. Interview panels, HR offices, board meetings where his presence was barely acknowledged. But nothing compared to the cold gravity of the federal courtroom he walked into that morning. High ceilings, marble walls, cameras lining the perimeter like sentinels. The seal of the United States behind the judge's bench, casting a shadow that even truth couldn't outrun. The nation was watching. The trial of the United States versus Douglas Lee Hargrove had become the most publicized civil rights case of the decade. Not because of its size, although the stakes were astronomical, but because of what it symbolized: the silent, coded machinery of modern racism, dragged into daylight by a young black intern who was never meant to be seen. Xavier took the stand with a stillness that betrayed none of the storms beneath his surface. His suit was simple, his tie loose, his jaw clenched just enough to suggest quiet resolve. He knew what they would try to do. He had rehearsed every tactic with Geneva: discredit, distract, dismantle. And still, nothing could prepare him for the scope of the machine now pointed at his name. Douglas sat opposite him in the defense chair, flanked by two white shoe attorneys from a firm known for defending oil companies and billionaires with blood on their ledgers. His face was carved from cold stone, unreadable, defiant. He didn't look at Xavier. He didn't need to. His entire legal strategy was built on the belief that Xavier was too young, too emotional, too damaged to hold up under pressure. The prosecution began with methodical clarity. They walked the jury through the files, the algorithms, the buried overrides. They showed how minority employees were sidelined systematically, how Xavier had uncovered it through independent analysis, how Claire's footage confirmed Douglas's direct involvement. The room was quiet as each slide flashed on the screen. No outbursts, no gasps, just the slow grinding of a myth coming apart. Then came Xavier's testimony. He didn't start with numbers. He started with a moment, the Christmas bonus ceremony. The way Douglas had stood on the podium and used words like legacy and fit to make exclusion sound like tradition. How it wasn't just about one bonus but an entire structure designed to filter out people who looked like him before they were even evaluated. They didn't need to say it out loud, Xavier said, voice steady. The system said it for them. He explained how the algorithm worked, not just the code, but the culture that allowed it to thrive. How the language was sanitized, the parameters disguised, the impact dismissed as coincidence. He described opening the hard drive left on his bed, the files, the override in his own record, and finally the realization that his excellence had been seen and then erased. When the defense rose to cross-examine, they moved quickly into character attacks. They brought up his juvenile records, foster care files, a years-old school suspension, a counselor's comment about rebellious behavior. They tried to paint him as unstable, ungrateful, opportunist. They called his leak a reckless vendetta, accused him of violating confidentiality, of harming good employees by going public. Their tone was patronizing, their language polished, but their strategy clear: make the jury question his motive, not the facts. Xavier didn't flinch. He answered every question directly, calmly. He didn't defend himself. He clarified. He didn't rise to their provocations. He let the truth stand. The emotional high point came when the defense attorney leaned in, voice dripping with implication, and asked, "Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Miles, that your actions show a lack of loyalty to the company that gave you a chance?" Xavier looked directly at him. "Loyalty isn't silence," he said, "especially when silence means someone else gets buried." The jury turned their heads collectively, their expressions shifted. Then the prosecution played the footage. Douglas on tape, pen in hand. The bonus reevaluation strategy. His voice clear and smug. "Make sure the optics stay clean. Diversity where we can see it, not where it counts." The room didn't erupt. It imploded. Douglas's lawyers objected, claimed the video lacked context, argued chain of custody. But it was too late. The words were already alive in the courtroom, in the ears of the jury, in the veins of every viewer watching the live stream from their homes, schools, phones. Claire testified next. Her voice was quieter than Xavier's, more strained, but no less powerful. She described the boardroom votes, the buried audits, the threats that followed her dissent. She didn't posture. She confessed. She admitted her complicity, her silence, her awakening. Her presence was the final nail in the defense's coffin, a witness from within, whose privilege couldn't be dismissed. The defense tried one last maneuver, a carefully worded closing argument, suggesting that legacy organizations often used imperfect tools, but with noble intent. That ambition was being redefined by a generation too impatient to understand nuance. That Douglas's mistake, if any, was in failing to modernize faster, not in prejudice. The prosecution answered with simplicity. They replayed the phrase, "not where it counts." When the judge announced a recess before the verdict, tension gripped the country like a held breath. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, not in protest, in vigil, holding signs not of anger but of truth. "We see you, Xavier. Algorithms aren't neutral. Make it count." Xavier sat quietly in the witness lounge, staring at the floor, hands folded. Geneva sat beside him, silent, steady. The cameras would never catch this part. The part where a young black man who was never supposed to make it past intern status had just pulled back the curtain on a billion-dollar empire and stood to hear if the country believed him. The judge returns, lifts the sealed envelope, and pauses, eyes scanning the room, then says, "Will the defendant please rise?" The courthouse hallway was impossibly still on the day Douglas Lee Hargrove was sentenced. For months the world had followed every twist of the trial, the leaks, the courtroom spectacle, the damning footage signed by Hargrove himself. But this moment was heavier than headlines, heavier than trending hashtags. It was the culmination of a story that had begun with a single exclusion and ended with a reckoning far beyond anything Xavier Miles had ever imagined. Inside the packed courtroom, Xavier stood beside Geneva Brandt, his civil rights attorney, whose sharp mind and unshakable conviction had become an unspoken anchor throughout the grueling legal battle. Reporters from every major network filled the benches behind him, cameras perched like vultures, lenses trained on the man whose life had been thrust unwillingly into the center of a national confrontation with systemic injustice. Yet in that room none of it felt like spectacle to Xavier. It felt like accountability. The judge's voice struck the hush like a gavel to glass. On the count of conspiracy to violate civil rights statutes, on the count of wire fraud related to federal contracts, on the count of falsification of compliance reporting, Each charge was read with solemn precision, each syllable a testament to the weight of evidence stacked before the court. When the sentence came, 22 years in federal prison, the courtroom reacted with a mixture of gasps, applause from the families of former employees, and sobering silence from those who understood that no sentence could truly repair what had been stolen. Douglas sat rigid in his chair, expression unreadable, the arrogance that had once defined his public persona replaced by something taut and brittle. The judge followed the prison sentence with an order that Hargrove Industries pay restitution, millions of dollars to thousands of wronged employees who had been systematically denied bonuses, promotions, leadership opportunities, and the dignity of equitable treatment. Outside the courthouse, the world exhaled. People wept. People hugged strangers. News crews debated what it all meant. Some called it a watershed moment in corporate accountability. Others whispered about the precedent it set for algorithmic justice. Xavier didn't watch the pundits. He watched the faces around him in the plaza, ordinary citizens whose lives had intersected with his story in countless small and meaningful ways. A woman held a sign that read, "Equality isn't optional." A group of students chanted truth over silence. A man who had lost his job years ago because of the algorithm's biased metrics wept openly, clutching a worn copy of the leaked file. Xavier didn't speak immediately. He let the moment exist in its full and complicated reality. The road here had not been easy. There had been threats, legal attacks, unseen pressure to step back, to make deals behind closed doors, to settle quietly. But here he was, not as a cautionary example, not as a footnote in someone else's narrative, but as the author of his own truth. When he finally stepped up to the press podium, his voice didn't shake. It resonated. What happened here, he began, was never just about one company. It was about the assumption that systems are neutral, that data cannot carry bias, that technology is inherently fair. We learned the hard way that bias doesn't need malice to be destructive. It only needs design. Reporters scribbled. Cameras stayed fixed. The moment survived analysis, critique, and the inevitable desire for simplification. Xavier said nothing simplistic. He spoke of the lives hidden in spreadsheets, the names buried beneath code, the dignity erased by decisions made in rooms no one questioned. Until now. "I didn't ask for this fight," he continued, pausing to look at the crowd before him. "But once I saw the truth, I couldn't turn away. Justice is not a statute. It is a continuous effort, a voice we must choose to keep alive, even when silence feels easier." The words echoed far beyond the courthouse steps. University classrooms played clips of his speech. Tech forums dissected the ethical implications. Civil rights groups broadcast the moment across digital channels to mobilize reform in organizations far bigger than Hargrove alone. Despite the global reaction, Xavier made a choice that surprised many. He turned down multiple lucrative job offers. Tech giants, think tanks, and corporate boards sent invitations, promising positions with vast influence and handsome compensation. But Xavier declined, not out of haughtiness, but purpose. Instead, he founded a nonprofit organization called the Fair Code Initiative, a watchdog coalition dedicated to auditing algorithms and tech systems for bias, transparency, and equity. It wasn't designed to punish. It was designed to awaken. The initiative recruited ethicists, programmers, legal scholars, and everyday citizens who had been affected by biased tech. Their mission was clear: to ensure that when code influences lives, fairness isn't just an afterthought. The nonprofit's offices were humble at first, a converted warehouse with sunlight that streamed through bare windows. Volunteers worked long hours, often for modest stipends or none at all, but there was a sense of purpose there that no corporate office could replicate. Xavier sat in meetings, guiding teams through piles of data, helping craft new standards for ethical coding, and mentoring young people who saw their own struggles reflected in his journey. Claire emerged from her recovery, like a quiet force of nature, though she bore the scars of her disappearance, a slight hesitation in her gait, a deeper shadow beneath her eyes. Her spirit was intact. She took up a leadership role at the Fair Code Initiative, spearheading outreach efforts to former employees and whistleblowers from other corporations. Theirs was a partnership rooted, not just in shared battle, but in shared vision. During an early press conference at the nonprofit's headquarters, a journalist asked Xavier if the victory felt complete. He paused, choosing his words with the same precision that had guided him through every twist of the journey. "Justice is not a finish line," he said. "It is a horizon we approach, step by step. Today we succeed in one fight. Tomorrow someone else must be ready for the next." Across the country, Students debated his words in dorms and lecture halls. Researchers referenced his case in academic papers. Activists adapted his framework to scrutinize everything from housing algorithms to educational software. The narrative that once painted him as unworthy had transformed into a rallying cry for fairness. But beneath the public triumphs, something unexpected rippled through the digital communities that had supported him. Small forums, once corners of fringe debate, began surfacing anomalies in national standardized testing software, in AI-driven job placement tools, in social media content delivery systems. Each thread wound back to the same question: if Hargrove wasn't the only place algorithmic bias thrived, then where else was it hidden? The initiative's phone lines lit up with voices from cities, towns, and rural areas, people whose opportunities had been quietly curtailed by systems no one audited, no one questioned. Code that seemed neutral, they now realized, could be architecture for a quiet exclusion more corrosive than any overt barrier. Xavier never expected to become a symbol. He expected to be heard, but once heard, his story became more than a legal victory. It became a mirror held up to a society that had trusted technology without asking whether it mirrored its values or its prejudices. On the anniversary of the verdict, now a date marked by civic groups as Algorithm Transparency Day, Xavier stood on a stage at a national tech conference. The room was packed with developers, ethicists, policymakers, and students alike. He spoke with urgency, not triumph. "We rebuilt one foundation," he said, "but every foundation can be tested. Our task now is not only to challenge bias where we find it, but to prevent it from being coded into the future we share." When the event ended, a young black student approached him. She held her tablet, replaying his speech from earlier in the day. Her eyes were determined, not deferential. "Your journey, it's real," she said. "But I want to know, what do I do next? Where do I begin?" Xavier smiled, seeing in her the same spark that once fueled his own restless curiosity. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered an invitation. "Begin where you are," he said. "Ask the questions no one else is asking, and don't stop when you find answers that make others uncomfortable." The student nodded, her screen still open, still showing his words. Then, with a deliberate calm, she turned the tablet toward a blank coding screen, the cursor blinking in a field of possibility. As Xavier watched from across the table, the student typed a single line of code, but when she hit enter, the screen flickered, and 3 words appeared: "System override detected." If you believe silence should never protect injustice, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Xavier's place? Speak up, or stay safe? Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that expose the systems built to keep us quiet. Together we don't just watch, we witness, we remember, and we rise.